Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters and friends. Welcome to the Dealing with Doubts for those that deal with doubts by Messengers of Peace Academy. Before we formally start, I just want you guys to comment to see if you can hear me. If you guys can hear me. Just want to make sure that you guys can hear me. Okay, let me just double check that you guys can. So if anyone can hear me, just comment on the comment box and just say yes, we can hear you. So I'm just going to wait for that to see if you guys can hear me. Sorry for the slight delay because there was a little bit of a problem with starting up Facebook as well. So can anyone confirm that I can be heard? People are liking, but they're not telling me if they can hear me. Can you guys hear me? Perfect. Okay, good. So let me just bring up my slides on my phone. So it's very good that you guys have come on board. Alhamdulillah. I'm just going to wait just a few more minutes for more people to start watching, and then we're going to formally start. I pray that everyone is having a great Saturday so far. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless every single one of you and protect every single one of you. And I really pray that this Facebook Live is going to be beneficial, inshallah. And I do appreciate that we have some questions from last week. And inshallah, we'll be dealing with them as well. Okay, fantastic. Right, so we're going to formally start now. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So welcome to Dealing with Doubts, the extended version. Now, the whole point of this Facebook Live is to give you a set of strategies and tools for you to be able to use for yourself and for others. So the whole point of this Facebook Live is for you to be able to deal with other people's doubts and to deal with yours as well. Because being in a state of doubt is not an abnormal thing, especially when you engage in this noble work. This work, as you know, is extremely noble because you're calling people to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we want to be used, we want to be used as tools, that Allah uses us as tools to manifest his guidance and mercy to mankind. And the important thing we have to realize here is that when we share Islam as an expression of us understanding that Allah is worthy of worship because it's a great act of worship. And we share Islam because we have genuine empathy and kindness, and we're committed to the well-being of all people, Muslim and non-Muslim. And this commitment to the well-being is expressed to the highest degree in the form of sharing Islam, because sharing Islam will grant them the best in this life and the life to come. And this really is based on a prophetic tradition, a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he said, love for linnas, love for humanity, what you love for yourself. Now, the key Arabic word here is linnas, love for the people, for humanity, what you love for yourself. Now, this is different from the other hadith that is found in the Arba'in, in the 40 hadith of An-Nawawi, because that mentions akhihi, your brother, love for your brother, what you love for yourself. But even An-Nawawi himself, commentating on that particular hadith, that particular prophetic tradition, he said this also means humanity. And he said this means essentially that you want goodness for people and guidance for people. And we have other prophetic traditions in Musnad Ahmed, and we have other scholars like the Maliki scholar Ibn Taqiq al-Eid. He also said this means humanity. So when you put all of these prophetic traditions together and you understand that the Prophet ﷺ, as per the words of the Quran, he is a rahmah, a mercy to all the worlds, then you know that we must love for others what we love for ourselves. And we love Allah and His Messenger ﷺ. We want to give this love to other people. We also love goodness for ourselves, and we love guidance for ourselves. So we must be committed in giving this goodness and giving this guidance to other people. So it's noble work, is great work. So when you engage in this work, inevitably you're going to fall into some type of doubt. But what I want to do now is distinguish between two types of doubts, okay? In a broad sense. So the first type of doubt is what you would call the doubts that are insinuations and whisperings, doubts that don't really belong to you, that you make a distinction between you agreeing with this doubt or you validating that doubt, and you make a distinction between you not wanting that doubt and you knowing it's wrong, and you make a distinction between being attached to that doubt and not being attached to that doubt. So if you can make that distinction, that doubt, I know it's wrong, it's baseless, and you make a distinction that you know that doubt doesn't belong to you, it's not yours, and you make a distinction that you abhor the implications of that doubt, then know that this is a sign of Iman. It's actually a sign of strong faith, and you should simply ignore it and not talk about it. And this is based on a brilliant piece of prophetic wisdom, prophetic advice by the Prophet ﷺ. And this hadith is in Sahih Muslim. He basically told the Sahaba that if they're having these types of doubts, that is a clear sign of faith. Okay, so let me just narrate the hadith for you. So it was narrated that Abu Hurairah radiallahu an, he said that some of the companions of the Messenger of Allah came to the Prophet ﷺ and said to him, we find in ourselves thoughts that are too terrible to speak of. And he, the Prophet ﷺ, said, are you really suffering from that? They said, yes. He, ﷺ, said, this is a clear sign of Iman. It's a clear sign of faith. Okay? It's a clear sign of faith. Because when you see the psychological and even intellectual reaction to these type of doubts, the Sahaba were like, you know, we find these things in ourselves that it's too terrible to speak of. And based on other narrations and based on the understanding of this hadith, essentially the Sahaba knew that this doubt was baseless. They abhorred this doubt. They didn't like this doubt. They didn't want to talk about this doubt. It was too terrible to speak of. Since they had that distinction, right, that they knew this doubt wasn't theirs, they knew it was baseless, they knew it was horrible and abhorrent and terrible, since they had that distinction, that was a clear sign of Iman. So when you have these type of doubts, the thing that you need to do is ignore them. Ignore them and don't speak about them. So if you have these type of doubts, that you can make those type of distinctions. In other words, you know it doesn't belong to you, you know it's baseless, you know it's abhorrent, that it's too terrible to speak of, then know, if you can make that distinction, then know that these doubts are just pointless. They're insinuations from a darker reality, right? The insinuations from shaitan, just totally ignore them. And your reaction, your psychological and spiritual and intellectual reaction is a sign of Iman, that you abhor them. You know they're baseless. You don't like them. They're not part of you, and you're terrified to even speak about them, or it would be terrible to speak about them. Then know that you should just ignore them. This is a sign of Iman, and continue the great work that you're doing. So if you have those type of doubts, then that's the strategy you need to follow. And obviously, when we talk about the other types of doubts, or the other type of doubt, the strategies that we are going to talk about are also very useful for these type of doubts as well. Namely, the afkar, the remembrance of Allah in the morning and the evening, and the du'as and the supplications that you have to make in order to strengthen your iman, all of these things. But we'll talk about that later. So before we talk about the type of doubts that we need to address, I really want to talk about the kind of understanding in Islam of what is certainty. Because when you're talking about doubt, you have to know certainty as well. So for you to doubt something, it means you're uncertain. And to really understand what being uncertain means, you have to know what certainty is in Islam. Now, we have to be very aware that we don't have a kind of post-secular understanding of certainty, a kind of abstract rationalist understanding of certainty, like it's 1 + 1 is equal to 2, right? That, you know, everything has to be deductive, for example. That is not the type of certainty that Islam talks about. Certainty in reality is not a thing based on an abstract mind, right? It's not something that exists within an abstract mind, but rather it's in the heart. Because when you study what the human being is, the human being in Islam is not an abstract robot. He's not a robot based on some algorithms and some, you know, binary code, ones and zeros, zeros and ones. So when we talk about certainty and even doubt, we have to understand what the human is, because the human being carries certainty, you know, has certainty, and the human being carries some doubt. Well, what is the human being? Well, the human being is not a computerized model. The human being is not a calculator. It's not an abstract mind. It's not a functional model, right? Rather, the human being is quite dynamic. And Allah tells us what the human being is. And Allah knows the human being better than we know what the human being is, because He is Al-Khaliq. He is the creator. So Allah, based on the Quran and the Sunnah, the revelation tells us that the human being is not just a mind. The human being is a ruh, a soul. The human being has a qalb, a heart, a spiritual heart. And the human being has an aql, and the aql is a function of the spiritual heart. And the human being has a nafs, an ego, if you like, and the human being has a fitrah, okay? So from this perspective, certainty and doubt has to be understood from this perspective. And all of these things, the ruh, the qalb, the fitrah, the aql, all of these things, the nafs, are at a dynamic interplay, okay? So when you're talking about certainty, you're talking about an intellectual and spiritual conviction. This is why in the Islamic tradition, there are like 3 grades, if you like, of certainty. And this is from the Quran itself. And the 3 grades of certainty are known as ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, and haqq al-yaqeen. So what is ilm al-yaqeen? Well, ilm, knowledge, the certainty of knowledge, is equivalent to saying, in a very crude way, someone that I trust is telling me that my house is on fire. There's a news report from someone that I trust. They're telling me, Hamza, your house is on fire, okay? May Allah protect all our houses, by the way, yeah? So your house is on fire. That's the first thing. That's ilm al-yaqeen. That's the certainty of knowledge. Ayn al-yaqeen, the certainty of the eye, of seeing and observing something directly, is equivalent of me seeing my house on fire, okay? The other type of yaqeen is haqq al-yaqeen, the truth of certainty, meaning it is a direct, actual representation of the state of affairs from the point of view that you are experiencing it, that you are in it. It is true by virtue of the reality itself, yeah? In other words, it's equivalent of me being in the fire in my house. So as you can see, there are 3 grades of certainty, and this is all from the Quran. You have ilm al-yaqeen, you have the yaqeen of knowledge. For example, a report coming from someone that you trust. You have ayn al-yaqeen, in other words, that you've directly observed it yourself. For example, I see 3 trees in my garden, therefore there are 3 trees in my garden. You've observed it. Then you have haqq al-yaqeen, which is the actual state of affairs. It's experiencing the actual state of affairs, or it's the truth of the actual state of affairs by virtue of the reality. In other words, An example is, in order for me to know that my house is on fire at this grade of certainty, haqq al-yaqeen, I have to be in my house and it's on fire. So as you can see, certainty is not a binary thing in the Islamic tradition. Certainty is not just based on some kind of algorithm. Certainty is a spiritual, intellectual reality, especially when it comes to all the other kind of theological concepts and ideas in Islam. So certainty has a grade. So you have grades of certainty. Ilm al-yaqeen, the certainty of knowledge. Ayn al-yaqeen, the certainty of observation. Haqq al-yaqeen, the certainty of the reality itself, right? By virtue of the reality. It's true by virtue because of it, because of the reality, right? So in other words, in philosophical terms, maybe you could describe this as necessity, or you could describe it as a logical truth or a conclusion that necessarily follows. That's haqq al-yaqeen, right? Nevertheless, I don't want to get too much into this, bring out all the kind of philosophical details, but the main point of this is to show you that the human being is not just an abstract mind. The human being has a fitrah, has a qalb, has an aql, and the aql is a function of the heart in the Islamic tradition. We have a nafs, we have a fitrah, and all of these things are a dynamic interplay. So therefore, it's not as simple as saying, 1 + 1 is equal to 2. And even the concept of certainty in Islam is not, a thing that, a button that you press or a lever that you pull, but rather there are grades of certainty. And if you're within that, then this is described as yaqeen, okay? But there are grades of yaqeen. But you could be within those grades, and that means you have certainty. Anything opposite to that is what is a doubt, okay? And this is different from the type of doubt that we just spoke about earlier, which is a whispering or an insinuation. Now, before we get into the doubts, the different types of doubts within the second category of doubt that we're talking about, we also have to understand that the human being doesn't start with doubt, because I already spoke about what the human being is from the Islamic point of view, and I mentioned the concept of the fitrah. So what is the fitrah? The fitrah comes from the Arabic triliteral stem, fatara, which you could have words like fatrun and fatarahu, that something has been created within us, that something is created within us, and this thing is the natural disposition, it's the innate nature, okay? And within the innate nature, we have forms of knowledge. You could call it proto-knowledge or primary knowledge, but the point is that you have forms of knowledge in the fitrah. And forms of knowledge in the fitrah include a few things, and the ulama, the scholars, discuss a few things like morality and other issues. But I want to focus on the two main forms of knowledge in the innate nature in the fitrah, and they include acknowledging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is al-haq, He is a reality, He exists. And number one, Allah is a reality, He exists. And number two, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worthy of extensive praise. Okay? And this is within the fitrah. But as per the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this hadith is in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that every child is born on a state of fitrah, but his parents change him. That's the essence of the hadith. So the parents corrupt the fitrah. Now ulama also talk about that society can corrupt it, the effects of society and other things. The point is though, the fitrah can be corrupted. I like to use the word, the fitrah becomes clouded, okay? So there's truth within every single one of us. We don't start with doubt. We already have some primary forms of truth given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah is a reality and He's worthy of extensive praise. And the fitrah gets clouded because of parenting, because of different issues. However, the way to uncloud the fitrah, to awaken the truth within, is not just one way. Because many people would say, well, if someone's fitrah is clouded, then give them the truth of Islam, there's philosophical argument. No. The fitrah could be clouded in different ways. There are many ways to uncloud the fitrah, to reveal the truth within, to awaken the truth within somebody, namely that Allah is a reality and that He is worthy of extensive praise. For example, it could be a rational argument. It could be spiritual experiences, negative experiences. It could be tadabbur, pondering within themselves and externally. It could be the good akhlaq of a Muslim. It could be direct revelation. They're experiencing direct revelation. There are so many ways to uncloud the fitrah. And they are means and not ends. They are means to uncloud the fitrah, to awaken the truth within. And you may need to use a combination of these means, these ways to uncloud the fitrah. You may just use one. Maybe rational arguments may work. Maybe rational arguments with good akhlaq may work. Good akhlaq with direct revelation may work. You just don't know how someone's fitrah is clouded. So it's our job as people who want to share Islam is that we want to humbly and compassionately try and uncloud someone's fitrah to awaken the truth within. And this enables us to be far more intellectually and spiritually mature, to really listen with the intention to understand, to try and assess people, to see how to uncloud the fitrah. And that's why when someone gives you a question, like a rational question, if you're listening very carefully, sincerely and authentically, and you want to engage with them, you may realize answering the question is not going to work. What may work is something else. But you can only be in that position if you understand the fitrah, how it's clouded, and you're sincere in awakening the truth within you. It's not all about winning an argument or giving people answers. And I've tried to do this before. Like, someone gave me a question and I didn't think I had to answer that philosophical question, because hopefully I was listening carefully and observing the person carefully and interacting with them authentically, and I realized something else was going on. So I changed my strategy. And that's why, as people who want to share Islam compassionately and intelligently, we have to be aware of this, and this would enable us to become more intellectually and spiritually mature, to understand and ask the question, how can I create awakenings within this person? You have to ask that question. How can I create awakenings within this person? How can I uncloud their fitrah? I may know the answer to this question, this philosophical question, but is that going to be enough for them? There's something else going on maybe, right? So we have to become intellectually and spiritually mature from that perspective. So now let's talk about the second broad category of doubts, which is the kind of doubts that are not within the grades of yaqeen that we spoke about. Do you remember when we talked about ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, haqq al-yaqeen? If people doubt, or even we doubt, and the doubts are not like the first type of doubts that we spoke about, which is based upon a whispering, that you can make a distinction that it doesn't belong to you. You can make the distinction that it's abhorrent. You can make the distinction that it's baseless. You can make the distinction that to utter it would be terrible. If it's that type of doubt, then you don't have a problem. It's a sign of iman. But if it's the type of doubt that takes you away from yaqeen, the threshold that we spoke about, then these strategies are going to help. But at the same time, the strategies that we're going to talk to you about are also going to help with the first one as well. And you're going to understand what I mean by that in a while. So this broad category of doubts that is outside of the threshold or outside of the grades of the levels of yaqeen that we spoke about can involve 5 main areas, okay? 5 main areas. Number 1, intellectual. Number 2, ethical. Number 3, social. Number 4, doubts caused by a lack of spiritual connection. And number 5, doubts caused by your relationship with your parents. Okay, so I just want to address these doubts. So let's do the first type of doubts, intellectual doubts. Now, obviously, we don't have time to go into all of the intellectual doubts, but I want to basically focus on the main one, right? So in our 21st century culture, the main source of intellectual doubts comes from science, okay, which I think is absurd, but anyway, we have to deal with it. So, you know, we have to appreciate that, you know, science is a beautiful method of study that has limitations. Nevertheless, this method of study is beautiful because it's progressive. What do I mean by that? I mean that the more we advance, the more we observe, the more we collate, the more we understand, the more we can come closer to the truth. Because the truth, and what I mean by truth here, is trying to understand how reality works, what physical reality is about, how does this observed universe work and what's within it. How do we understand our direct and indirect observations? Science deals with that. As Professor Elliot Sober, who's an atheist, he's a philosopher of science. He basically argues in his essay Empiricism that at any moment in time, scientists are restricted to the observations they have at hand. So, we're restricted to observations. We're never going to have an infinite number of observations. Therefore, there could be another observation that changes the way we understand reality. And that's the beauty of science. So, and we have to appreciate that. And in the Islamic tradition, we know that, Muslims, practicing Muslims, were pioneers. In concerning the scientific method. If you read the work of David C. Lindbergh on the history of science, he actually cites Ibn al-Haytham, and Ibn al-Haytham, he wrote the book on optics, and David C. Lindbergh says that Ibn al-Haytham was a kind of key milestone, one of the pioneers of developing the modern scientific method as we know it today. And if you look into the autobiographical accounts of Ibn al-Haytham basically says that he wanted to find out how the will of God manifests itself in reality, in physical reality, how it works. And that's the beauty of science. Now, since we appreciate science from that point of view, sometimes we can be mistaken in the epistemic value, in the epistemic weight of scientific conclusions. Okay, what does that mean? I mean the truth value of scientific conclusions. Because it's amazing and it's progressive and it works, we think, wow, it's the absolute truth. And this misunderstanding is the source of intellectual doubt. It's actually not because of science itself, but it's because of our misunderstanding concerning the philosophy of science. Yeah, and this is what I want to try and unravel now. Now, unfortunately, what we do is we think that scientific conclusions and theories are 100% true. They're absolutely true. Not one scientist says this. Not one philosopher of science says this. This is well established in academia. There's always an element of doubt. There's always a possibility of our well-confirmed theories and conclusions in science to change. Now, by the way, when I talk about theories and conclusions, I'm not talking about one direct observation. A direct observation is observation. That's not a source of doubt. There's nothing in the direct observed world, looking at one observation, like the moon, it's round. Those type of observations are not usually a source of doubt when it comes to religion, specifically Islam. What we're talking about here is something that is based on a scientific conclusion or theory, okay? And a scientific conclusion or theory are usually based on more than one observation, right? So you have multiple observations, we're trying to understand those observations, right? How do we explain those observed phenomena, right? Where are the kind of links, the causal links, or how do we develop a theoretical understanding and a conclusion to understand all of these observations together? Stuff like that. So it's not just based on one observation. That's not science. Yes, science is based on observations, but just observing something directly yourself, that's not a scientific conclusion. It's just an observation. Like, for example, I see the moon, it's round, therefore the moon is round. You wouldn't really call that a scientific conclusion or theory. You would call that's my observation. In order for something technically to be considered a scientific conclusion or theory, then you need more than one observation, and to use your reason over those observations to understand how they connect, how they relate, are there any causal links, to understand all those observations together. Okay, I know this may be already understood, but I just wanted to simplify it and just, even in a crude way, just to bring it out there to make the distinction, because some people, they sometimes don't know how to make the distinction between one direct observation and something that is a scientific conclusion or a theory. So what we're talking about here is scientific theories and conclusions. And by the way, when we talk about scientific theories, many people unfortunately think, oh, it's just a theory. See, when scientists use the word theory, it's not the same usage as we use in, for example, popular culture. That, oh, it's just a theory, meaning it's, you know, it's just your own idea that you got hardly any evidence, right? No, when we say something's a theory in science, it's one of the highest levels, right? That it has a high epistemic value, a high value of truth. Because a well-confirmed theory means that it has predictive power, that it basically helps us understand most of the observations we have at hand on a particular set of phenomena. So when we say something's a well-confirmed theory, that has a very high value, right? So some people unfortunately think that scientific conclusions and scientific theories should be a source of intellectual doubt. Now, there is a huge problem here. The huge problem here is because we give scientific conclusions and we give scientific theories the wrong epistemic value. Yes, they're very high from a scientific point of view, but they're never absolutely true. They're always subject to change, even well-confirmed theories. So if scientific conclusions or theories seem to go against revelation, the Quran and the Sunnah, and we can't reconcile them, then it should never be a source of doubt. Because one source of knowledge, in other words, the Quran and Sunnah, is from the divine, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Alim. He is the knowing. He's Al-Hakim. He is the wise. He has the totality of wisdom and knowledge. We have just particular fragmentary pieces of knowledge. Allah has the picture. We just got the pixel, right? So that's one source of knowledge. And its epistemic value is absolute because it's come from the one who knows everything. And you have another source of knowledge, science, which is beautiful, it's amazing, it's great, but its epistemic value is not the same. You can't make them the same. Its epistemic value is always going to be lower because, one, it's human knowledge and we're never going to know everything. And it's based on the scientific method. And when we study the philosophy of science, we know that we can have another observation that can be at odds with our current conclusions, which was based on limited observations. So we can have another observation that can change our conclusions, right? Since that's the case, then if science and scientific conclusions and theories contradict revelation, then it should never, never be a source of doubt. Why? Because you know the sources of knowledge now. The Quran and Sunnah, we could prove via other means that they come from Allah the Divine, and Allah is Al-Hakim, Al-Alim. He has the totality of knowledge and wisdom. Allah has the picture, we just got the pixel. And science is beautiful, it's great, but it's never the whole picture. It's just a representation of the state of affairs. It's not the actual state of affairs, if you like. It doesn't mirror it directly because you're never ever going to have all the observations, or you're never going to have all scientific knowledge. There can always be another observation that comes into your, that comes to our attention that contradicts our current conclusions or changes our current conclusions, which is based on limited data. And this is very important to understand, okay? Now, by the way, this strategy works if you believe that the scientific conclusion cannot be reconciled with the Quran and the Sunnah. If it can be reconciled, then you don't have a problem, but you should still be very careful and you should still say, yes, but that scientific conclusion may not be absolutely true, because what I'm going to talk about concerning the philosophy of science is going to help you understand that. So once you try to reconcile and there's no reconciliation, it should never be a source of doubt because of what I'm going to say right now and what I've said so far. So when we say you can always have another observation that contradicts previous conclusions, this basically summarizes something in the philosophy of science called the problem of induction. Now, most, if not all, of scientific conclusions and theories rest upon induction. What is induction? Induction is a thinking process where you move from the known to the unknown, the known to the unknown. Induction is a thinking process where you move from limited set of observations and you make a conclusion for an unobserved. Let me give you an example. I go to Wales and I want to find out what the color of sheep are, and I count 10,000 sheep. That's all my data, and all of those sheep are white. Therefore, I'm going to conclude all sheep are white, or at least the next sheep that I'm going to observe is going to be white. That's a valid conclusion, it's a valid inference, because that's what my data is telling me. However, it could be the case that the next observed sheep is going to be black, and we know that black sheep exist. So this is a crude but good example to show the problem of induction. There can always be another observation that contradicts our current conclusions, which is based on limited observations and limited data. This is so well known in the philosophy of science and so well known amongst scientists that even the evangelical atheist Professor Richard Dawkins, yes, and check it out for yourself, in his book, A Devil's Chaplain, he talks about this very clearly, and I'm paraphrasing. He says that, you know, the thinkers and scientists in the future, they may change Darwinism or the way we understand evolution completely, to the point of even rejecting Darwinism. Why? Because we may have future evidence. We may observe things or understand things that we haven't observed and understood. It's simple as that. And that's the beauty of science. If you just understand this basic idea in the philosophy of science, nothing in science should ever bother you. If you understand that the Quran and Sunnah come from Allah and they're absolute, and they come from Al-Alim, Al-Hakim, the knowing, the wise, he has the totality of wisdom and knowledge. If you understand that, and you understand that science is great, it's beautiful, but it's never 100% absolute because of the problem of induction, meaning we can have a future or another observation that contradicts our current conclusions, which is based on limited data. Once you understand that, if these two different sources of knowledge collide and you can't reconcile them, then they should never give you a problem. Now, this doesn't mean you reject the science. It just means you don't take it into your aqidah. You don't take it into your aqidah. You don't take it into your creed. You don't take it into your beliefs, the beliefs that you believe to be absolutely true. But rather, you downgrade scientific conclusions and theories. You say, this is the best that we have, and it works, and we're going to use it until something more true comes along, right? So this is a way to deal with it. Now, one would argue, hold on a second, Hamza, isn't there a problem here? Because science works. And if these scientific conclusions and theories are working, then they must be absolutely true. And if they're absolutely true, then we have to accept them. And if we accept the conclusions and theories that contradict Islam, then that's going to give us a source of doubt. No, 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 no. This again is flawed logic, because you're assuming that something that works has to be absolutely true. No, it doesn't. It's a logical fallacy. This is an error in our logical reasoning, because it doesn't follow that just because something works, it must be true. Just because something works, it must be true. Let me give you an example, even in the history of science. In the 1700s, you know, we as humanity, well, not collectively, but there were human beings, scientists at that time, they developed this theory called phlogiston. What was phlogiston? Phlogiston was this idea that when you burn combustible objects, they released phlogisticated air. So in 1772 or 1773, Dan Rutherford used this workable theory to discover the truth of nitrogen. But after some time, they understood and they came to the conclusion that phlogiston was false. So what do we learn from this? That we could get a truth from a workable theory that is false. So just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. Just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. So we can't use the kind of argument that all these conclusions and theories are actually working for us, therefore they must be absolutely true. That's logically fallacious. It doesn't work at all. And even in the philosophy of science, you'll understand, I think it was Elliot Sober, Professor Elliot Sober, who's also an atheist, he basically says that you can have theories that have been proven to be wrong that still work, that they're quite good, right? I'm going to try and get you the quote properly later. But yeah, so from this point of view, it should never be science should never be a source of intellectual doubt in any shape or form. If you understand the philosophy of science, if you understand the problem of induction, and you understand that just because something works, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's true. Okay, as I've just discussed. So anything in science should never give you a cause of concern from the point of view that it takes you away from the yaqeen threshold, right? It takes you away from the different grades of yaqeen that we spoke about in the beginning. So if you understand the philosophy of science, you understand the problem of induction, you understand that just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true, then that's going to solve all your problems when it comes to scientific issues. And you should know this, and you should be able to teach this and articulate it to other people as well, inshallah. There's much more in the philosophy of science, but this should be enough to continue your journey. And maybe in another Facebook Live, we could go into much more detail. So the second cause of these type of doubts is also ethical doubts. Now, you really have to understand, brothers and sisters, that we are products of our society. We are products of our society. And when you study social psychology, you see that ethical norms can change, and that happens all the time, right? For example, just look at something that was seen to be okay 40 or 50 years ago, today now is seen not to be okay, or vice versa. 40 and 50 years ago, something was seen to be abhorrent, now times have changed and society has moved on, or in some cases moved backwards, and people have now a different moral outlook, a different moral disposition. And usually that moral outlook and moral disposition is based on some kind of collective understanding, is on some kind of social influence, but that's also based upon some kind of first principles or some kind of philosophy or worldview that we adopt. The point here is we have to learn to be leaders, and we should learn not to be affected by this. Now, why? Because when it comes to moral knowledge, there are moral facts that we believe to be true, irrespective of time, place, and social pressure. We believe in moral facts, right? There are facts in the universe that are moral, and they're true, and they're absolute. From this point of view, we believe that morals are mind independent. They're mind independent and nafs, psychology independent, emotion, they're independent to our emotions and our intellects. That doesn't mean we can't understand them through our intellects, but it means they're independent from the point of view that if the whole world were to come together and they would say that shirk, that polytheism, that worshipping other than Allah is morally good, then that would still be wrong, irrespective of what someone's mind has come up with, irrespective of what someone's psychology or emotions have come up with. It's mind independent. It's true irrespective of what people say. Just like we would say killing a 5-year-old child is wrong, is immoral, irrespective if the whole world were to come together and say it's actually a good thing to do, right? No, it's not. So we believe that there are moral values, and these moral values are mind independent, from meaning that they exist outside of a particular opinion or disposition, that they are true even if we didn't exist, okay? And we would say these moral values therefore require some kind of grounding, right? This idea that moral values are mind independent, they require some kind of grounding to explain, number one, how they are outside of the human mind and human emotions, and to explain their source, where they came from. This idea is an idea in meta-ethics, moral ontology or meta-ethics. If it's true that moral values are objective in that sense, that they're outside of the limited human mind and limited emotions, and they're outside so to speak, then how do you explain that they're outside of the limited mind and human emotions? They're objective in that way. They transcend human subjectivity. How do you explain that? And how do you explain where they came from? Now, this is what you call moral ontology, or questions referring to an area of philosophy called meta-ethics. And we would say that the divine commands explain the objective nature of these morals, that they're outside of the human mind, because Allah is transcendent, He's distinct from creation, right? So His commands explain the objective nature of moral values, and they explain the source of those moral values, which is the commands themselves too. So from this point of view, we believe that there are some moral values and virtues and ethics that are objective, that transcend what society says, and that transcend time and place. And these come from Allah Himself via His commands. So we have to understand that someone has to draw the line, right? And we have to draw the line somewhere. And we believe the drawing of the line, the moral line, comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And not only that, we believe that they are objective, irrespective of what people say to us. Okay? They're mind independent from that point of view. And if that's the case, some morals are objective in that nature, that killing a 5-year-old is always going to be wrong, irrespective of what people tell us, irrespective of how society changes, then we believe moral values are mind independent. If that's the case, how do you explain that outside of human subjectivity, and how do we explain where they came from? Allah's commands. Allah transcends human subjectivity. Allah is objective by definition because He has a totality of wisdom and knowledge. Allah is distinct from His creation and totally unique and transcendent. So Allah can make the universal moral claim. Allah knows and we don't. Allah is Al-Bar, He is the source of all goodness, right? And so He can make it, so He explains why these morals are objective, and He explains the source, which is Allah's commands. Allah Himself, He has commanded these things. That shirk is absolutely immoral, irrespective of time and place. That Tawheed, worshipping Allah, is morally good, irrespective of time and place, irrespective of what people tell us, irrespective of if the whole world were to come together and say that no, worshipping Allah is evil. They were wrong. It's always going to be morally good. It's always going to be right. It's always going to be a moral truth, irrespective of what people say. Now, so therefore, we need to understand this and understand that our moral intuitions and our moral guidance comes from the Quran and the Sunnah, comes from revelation, comes from Allah's commands. And we need to be conscious of this and not to fall into the traps of, the ever-changing social moral norms. Now, don't get me wrong. Many of the societies that we live in, there's this kind of almost universal understanding of what is the good. Like, no one's going to kill each other. Everyone knows that they shouldn't kill each other. Everyone knows that they shouldn't steal. But because societies become ever more complex, there are many areas that there's going to be disagreement. As long as you disagree with compassion and with hikmah and with wisdom and reason, and you try to articulate yourself, then there's nothing wrong with that. That's the spirit of tolerance. We should do it in the spirit of tolerance. But for us to be prevented from these type of ethical doubts, we just always have to remind ourselves, well, are morals for me objective or subjective? Well, they're objective. Many morals are objective. They're mind independent. They're outside of the limited human mind. I know killing a 5-year-old child and murder and shirk is always going to be morally wrong and morally evil, irrespective of what people tell me. If the whole world were to come together and say they're good things, no, I know they're bad things. Therefore, they're mind independent. Well, how do I explain the mind independent nature of these morals, that they're objective? Well, and how do I explain where they came from? Well, it's Allah's commands, because Allah is distinct and transcendent from the universe. He can make the universal moral claim. And He's obviously distinct and transcends human minds and human subjectivity. And Allah's commands explain where these morals came from, because Allah commanded them into existence, right? So this explains that. And also, what's very important for you to understand, that Allah is the source of moral goodness. Because Allah says He's Al-Bar, He is the source of goodness. So we have to understand that we have a fragmentary understanding of moral knowledge from that point of view, and Allah has a totality of moral knowledge. So the easy way of dealing with this is, well, always focus on who Allah is. Be God-centric. Think about who Allah is. Allah is the source of goodness. Allah knows everything and we don't know everything. That includes moral knowledge. Allah's commands explains the objective nature of morals, explains why they're mind independent, and explains where they came from. So that's the moral ontological aspect to deal with, how we believe that some morals are objective, and that would prevent us from changing our sense of objective morality based on social changing norms. And also from a moral epistemological perspective, meaning Well, how do we get to know what these objective morals are? Then we know it's the Quran and Sunnah, because Allah has all moral knowledge. Allah is the source of all goodness. Allah is the only deity worthy of worship, and the only deity worthy of worship is the highest moral being. So when he commands something, we know it's morally good, irrespective of what our mind tells us. Why? Because of the fact that Allah's commands are a derivative of his nature, and his nature is Ar-Rahman, he is the merciful, he is Al-Wadud, he is the loving, he is Al-Alim, the knowing, he is Al-Hakim, the wise. So not only can we explain the objective nature of morals, or moral values, moral good, but we could explain why our certain moral position on things is actually morally good, and we actually know what morals are because of who Allah is. He is the source of goodness. He is the source of morality. And this doesn't mean we suspend our minds. No. Allah tells us to use our aql, our intellect, to understand Allah's moral commands. What are the moral variables? What does Allah intend here? What was the context? What is the situation? We have to have this nuanced moral philosophy. Islam has a very rich, nuanced moral philosophy. We have to use our minds over the commands of Allah to understand what they really are and what the implications are. But once we've understood, then we say this is the moral truth. So to cut a very long story short, the way to deal with this type of ethical doubts is, number one, to understand that the source, the only thing that explains objective morals is Allah's commands. And the only thing that explains the source of objective morals are Allah's commands. And the only thing that explains the nature of objective morals are Allah's commands, because objective morals are mind independent. Allah explains that because he is independent to human beings. He is the independent. He is transcendent. Laysa kamithlihi shay. He transcends human subjectivity. He is objective by definition because he has no deficiency or flaw in his knowledge and wisdom, etc., etc. And also he explains the source of these objective morals because Allah commands them into existence. And also Allah explains why we believe our ethics in the Quran and Sunnah are true, because they've come from the one who is Al-Bar. He is the source of all goodness. So this is how you deal with ethical doubts. If you always remember that, then irrespective of how society is going to perceive something morally, then you know how to articulate a case for Islamic morals. That Allah makes sense of objective moral truths, and what Allah tells us what is moral is also true because of who He is. He is Allah, and He is the Al-Bar, the source of all goodness. And His commands, or what He commands us to do, is in line with His nature, and His nature is loving. His nature is the merciful. He is the knowing. He is the wise. Now, we have to understand, obviously, when we come to these type of discussions, that we do it with rahmah, we do it with mercy, and we do it with hikmah, we do it with wisdom. Now, another category of such social doubts is, well, another aspect of the second type of doubts that we're talking about is social doubts. Now, we have to understand that it takes a village to bring up a child. This is an African proverb. And we have to understand that, you know, human beings are not just an abstract mind. I mean, even if you study cognitive psychology, many, or at least a few cognitive psychologists or cognitive scientists, they're telling us that your beliefs are not good predictors for your behaviors. You know, don't tell me about your beliefs, tell me about your practice, what you actually do. Because they've come to an understanding that the human being is not just an abstract mind with a set of propositions and beliefs, and you're just going to act in a particular way. So we have to understand that society can create doubts even though they don't exist, based on some psychological issues, social psychological issues. Now, we have to understand that there are social norms in the societies that we live in. And these social norms are developed based on two main things according to a particular understanding in social psychology. And these two main things are called informational social influence and normative social influence. Okay, so what's informational social influence? Informational social influence is that I may have a doubt about something, and if I can't satisfy that doubt and gain a sense of certainty within myself or from my subgroup, I'm going to go to the dominant group in order to satisfy that need to be certain, because I have a doubt. And they will provide that certainty just because of the size of their group, yeah, even though it might not be true. And this is a human need that we have. We have a need to feel certain. We have a need to feel certain. And if we're in doubt about something and we can't satisfy that doubt or clarify that doubt, we can't become certain from ourselves, within ourselves, and we can't get that certainty from our subgroup, we're going to go to the dominant group by virtue of them being dominant. So sometimes we may believe something to be true or something to be false just by virtue of the dominant group saying it. So we have to be very careful about this, because our psychological needs include that we need to feel certain. If I can't find that certainty within myself or within my subgroup, I'm going to go to the dominant group. Normative social influence, the other aspect that helps develop the social norm, is based on a need to belong. Need to belong. Now, every human being has a need to belong, and if they don't find that need to belong within their subgroup, they're going to go to the dominant group just to get that belonging. But they would get that belonging even if it means suspending the truths that they believe. Because if the truths that they believe is going against that dominant group, but they have a need to belong, that need to belong may override their beliefs, and they would just artificially adopt the dominant group's beliefs just to belong. And this is why the need to feel certain and the need to belong are very, very strong factors when it comes to developing children and teenagers and young adults and even normal people. Because if you don't satisfy those two things within the Muslim community and within the kind of intellectual tradition of Islam and exposing people to that, then if they don't have the right answers, they don't have that belonging, they're going to go to the dominant group. And this is why many people who leave Islam, it's not really to do with intellectual questions per se, but it's to do with a need to belong. And it's a need to feel certain, and they're not getting that certainty from their subgroup, the Muslim community. Even though we may have the answers, but people are brushing them away, they'll go to the dominant group. So it's very important for us to understand this, and to really, when we're dealing with others and dealing with ourselves, to ask ourselves the question, am I connected to my community? Do I feel a sense of belonging? Are they connected to the community? Do they feel a sense of belonging? If not, how do we facilitate that? Because many people will adopt false ideas just to belong. This is social psychology. And this is why we need to help create a Muslim community that has tolerance and rahmah and compassion and being inclusive, obviously within our moral boundaries, but to be as inclusive as possible, and not to basically create this kind of cultish sectarian, theater, this cultish sectarian society that pushes people away because they just don't simply belong. We need to understand that everybody is different, and even when we study the Sahaba, the companions, they had different personalities as well. We don't have this kind of, everyone is coming off a conveyor belt and they look the same, act the same, and speak the same. It just doesn't work that way. Human beings are dynamic and different. Even the Sahaba were different. When you think about Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, you think about a different personality. When you think about Ali radiallahu anh, you think about a different personality. Think about Umar radiallahu anh, you think about a different personality. Yes, they were pious, they obeyed Allah for sure, but the expressions of that were different, even sometimes in clothing and in attitudes and in expression, right? So from this point of view, we need to appreciate that and not push people away, create a sense of belonging. And even within ourselves, what have I done to connect with my community? Because this really helps in maintaining your sense of certainty. Also, we need to ask the question, am I going to the right sources to clarify these doubts? And are we creating a society for these people who have these doubts to address them effectively? Or are we just taking them to an imam who doesn't know much about Western thought, for example, and maybe unfortunately he comes from a uneducated background? Are we taking our children or that person to that type of person? That's going to push them away. They're not going to find certainty within the subgroup, the Muslim community. They're going to go to the dominant group. So we need to ask ourselves the questions: are we going to the right sources for knowledge? Now, are we taking people to the right source of knowledge? Because that knowledge exists in Islam. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is why I want to introduce a very important point here that really summarizes the whole Facebook Live, which is all of these type of doubts as well really are solved with just increasing knowledge. Knowledge is your barrier to doubt. And the greatest form of knowledge in the Islamic tradition, I'm not saying it's the only, but the greatest form of knowledge in the Islamic tradition is knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Knowledge of Allah. The more we know Allah, His names and attributes, who He is, the more our doubts would diminish. The more we would have, it will close the door to any type of doubts. The more we know Allah's commands, what did Allah intend? What is Allah saying to us? What does Allah want from us? The more we have a God-centric mindset, the more we understand, the more basically the door to doubts will be closed. So knowledge of the deen actually closes the door to doubts. So that's why it's very important that we create leaders. We don't have a choice, because since these two aspects create the social norm, informational social influence, normative social influence, we have a responsibility to create leaders and to create structures in our society that facilitate dealing with doubts and facilitate people's sense of belonging and need to belong. So we create a society where I can belong to, then you can belong to, within the Islamic framework. They have a sense of belonging to the Muslim community, and obviously they have a sense of belonging to the wider community as well, because we are committed citizens to the well-being of all of our citizens. But obviously within our nation states there are different communities, and in order to preserve our identity and not to have any doubts, our sense of belonging should be to the sub-community, the subgroup for sure. And we need to facilitate one that is compassionate and inclusive as much as possible, to include all our brothers and sisters, and to be able to open the door to our brothers and sisters in humanity to come and join our community too. So there's that sense of belonging, because it's so important. Because if you don't have that sense of belonging, people would have doubts, because they may give up their own ideas just to get a sense of belonging from the dominant group if they can't find it from their subgroup. Also, we have to be able to, show people the path of knowledge, take people to the right sources, so they know where they could satisfy their sense of certainty and how to overcome and deal with these doubts, because we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We have a great intellectual nuanced tradition that needs to be brought out into the open more. Okay, so if we do those two things, then it would deal with these social type of doubts. The other type of doubt within this category of doubt is spiritual doubts. Now, you may think, well, how does this relate to this category of doubt? Because it doesn't really deal with any of the threshold. It doesn't deal with ilm al-yaqeen, haqq al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen. Doesn't deal with that. And this is a bit, what spirituality got to do with it? Well, remember, in the Islamic tradition, the aql, the intellect, is a function of the heart, and the heart can be hardened and softened. So, if you don't have adequate connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you have the spiritual diseases of the heart, right? Like, we all have, especially me, I have spiritual diseases of the heart. I need to deal with them. You need to deal with them. And if we don't, then our hearts could be hardened. And that would affect the way we understand knowledge. That would affect our level of certainty, because these things are all connected and correlated, as we mentioned earlier, about what the human being is. So a lot of doubts are based on a lack of connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what we have to do, we have to understand that really, the basis of all kufr, the rejection of truth, is based on two things. If you study the Quran: hawa, desires, and kibr, arrogance. Desires and arrogance. So we have to work on controlling our desires in the Islamic through the understanding of the Islamic tradition, and also controlling arrogance. Arrogance is not liking good things and enjoying beauty, but arrogance is rejecting the truth and thinking you're better than others. So we have to engage on a spiritual program that's in line with the Quran and Sunnah to soften our hearts, which would facilitate increasing our certainty. It will facilitate closing the door to any doubts. Why? Because your heart now becomes more purified, less hard, more soft. And therefore, when you're using your aql, and the aql is a function of the heart, it's going to be used properly. It's going to be oiled. It's going to be well oiled, right? Like in a car, you have to put You have to change the oil now and then in order for it to function properly and work. Likewise, you have to be connected to Allah. You have to follow spiritual path in line with the Quran and Sunnah in order to soften the heart and to prevent the heart from being exposed to doubts and to open the door to any doubts. Now, there's a few things that we can deal with. Now, obviously, from the spiritual blemishes of the heart, there are 4 main diseases of the heart where all the other diseases spring forth from, okay? These diseases of the heart include kibr, arrogance, riya, ostentation, showing off, ujub, self-amazement, that you're amazed by yourself, and hasad, jealousy, envy. Not the type of envy that you want something that someone else has, but you want something what someone else has and you don't want them to have it either, right? So you need to try and understand, do you have kibr, arrogance? Do you think you're better than others? Are you rejecting the truth? You need to think, do I have riya, ostentation? Am I doing acts of worship and good deeds for other than Allah's sake? Am I doing it to show off? Am I doing it for people to hear about later? Have I started the deed with a pure intention and with ikhlas, with sincerity, but later on I'm starting to show off about it, right? That's a form of riya as well. Do I have ujub, self-amazement? Fine, I might not be showing off to people that I'm so great, but internally you may think you're amazing. That's a spiritual disease because you think you're the source of your abilities. It's not. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're just an empty tool that Allah uses to manifest His will. Do you have hasad, envy, which basically means that you're not happy with the decree of Allah? That not only do you want what that person wants, but you don't want them to have it, meaning you're not happy with the way Allah has decreed reality, which is really terrible because it means you're saying that Allah's names and attributes, who Allah is, He's not perfect. He's imperfect, he's deficient. This is a terrible, terrible thing to even assume. You may not be assuming it, but that's the implication. Because you're like, why did Allah give him that? I want to take it away. Like Allah's choice wasn't good enough, right? You're diminishing the who Allah is. You're saying that He made an imperfect choice. But Allah's names and attributes are maximally perfect to the highest degree possible. They are transcendent. They have no deficiency and no flaw. So if Allah gives someone a car or more knowledge, then that's the best thing. Because whatever Allah chooses for you and other people is the best thing. And you saying, no, I want it and I want to take it away from them, you're basically saying you're not happy with Allah's choice. So I'm not going to go into how to deal with the spiritual diseases. There's lots to go through. It's a huge science. But think about, do you have ujub, self-amazement? Do you have riya, ostentation? Do you have hasad? And what level is it? Do you have kibr and arrogance? And what level is it? What am I doing in my day-to-day practice to remove these blemishes from my heart slowly? So I implore you, and especially myself first and foremost, because I'm full of these, how to deal with them, how to purify your heart from this. And I'm telling you, it will protect you from any source of doubt. The first type of doubt that we talked about, and the second type of doubt. And what's very important is that, try and follow a daily practice in your spiritual routine, obviously in accordance with the Quran and Sunnah. Make sure you do your afkar, your dhikr, your du'as, your not only your remembrance of God, but also your supplications to Allah in the morning and the evening without fail. They protect you from a whole range of things. They protect you from doubt. They protect you from any type of evil. They protect you. There's so many things that provide a protection to your heart and to your iman and to your faith and your certainty, right? And learn the du'as from the Quran and Sunnah that are about certainty. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he used to make a du'a very regularly, which in English is, oh Allah, you are the controller of hearts, so make my heart firm on your religion, right? So learn the du'as about being content with the religion of Islam, to have that sense of certainty, because fundamentally, even if you adopt these strategies, the iman, faith, and increasing your level of certainty and being within the threshold of yaqeen, having certainty, is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So make sure you're on that spiritual path. Finally, brothers and sisters, sometimes our doubts are caused by a lack of a good relationship with our parents. Okay. Now, there's an interesting study that was in the journal Signpost. That's the shortened name for it. And it was published in 2018, and it's by Eric W. Dolan. And I took this from the Yaqeen Institute's essay by Ruhi Tahir. It's called The Importance of Conscious Parenting and Raising Confident Muslims. And it quotes, people tend to become atheists at a younger age when their religious parents talk the talk but don't walk the walk. The study provides evidence that exposure to religiously motivated actions plays an important role in the onset of atheism. So our relationship with our parents, people's relationship with their parents, is critical with regards to doubts, is critical with regards to moving away from the religion. And we need to focus on that. We need to focus on getting people to have a good, positive relationship with their parents, and also to understand that the past doesn't equal the future. Yes, your parents may have talked the talk, but they never walked the walk. And that created this kind of conflict in your mind about respect for religious values and respect for even maybe your parents and respect for Islam being the truth. But you need to make a distinction between what people say and what people do, and to look at the kind of what Islam actually is, and to isolate away from your experiences. I know that's very difficult, but the minute we understand that maybe me moving away from Islam, maybe my internal doubts have to do with the way I was brought up, and that unfortunately at that level of my parents' understanding and development, they weren't really walking the walk, they weren't following the Islamic tradition properly. That could be a source of why I'm doubting today. It might have nothing to do with intellectual stuff. It may to do with just the kind of psychodynamic aspect, the fact that how I used to relate to my parents, and that's affected me. Realizing that is opening the door to change and exploring that, right? Obviously, I'm not a psychotherapist or a counselor, or anything. I don't claim to be, but I wanted to put that at the end just for you to think about, maybe sometimes we are pushing ourselves away. So when we deal with people who have doubts and, they are pushing themselves away from Islam, or they've left completely, it could be because of the relationship with their parents, something that needs to be unraveled. I don't have the answers to that. I'm not a qualified practitioner, but I just wanted to put that in the end very quickly in order for you to start exploring that, because, I've seen that a lot. Many of my experiences of people who have left Islam, they've claimed intellectual stuff, but after a few hours or a long conversation, it was about parenting. It's about how they related with their parents and how they saw Islam through the behavior of their parents, which is very, very interesting. And that needs to be acknowledged. So just to summarize what we've done so far, brothers and sisters, we've completed the Facebook Live, but I want to summarize everything. Number one, we spoke about two key types of doubts. The first type of doubt is where you can make a distinction that the doubts are not yours, they don't belong to you, you don't agree with them. You make a distinction that they're abhorrent, that they're baseless, and that to even utter them would be terrible. If you have that type of feeling, then you don't need anything. You don't need this Facebook Live, because the Prophet said, this is a clear sign of Iman. It's a clear sign of faith. All you have to do, keep on doing what you're doing, keep on being connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and just ignore them, right? Then we spoke about the different levels of yaqeen, of certainty. It's not just a button that you press or a lever that you pull, but there are grades of certainty. And we talked about the human being is not just an abstract
Alert
mind.
from Google Chrome, Austin Evans.
The human being is not just a an abstract functional model, computerized model, but rather we have a ruh, a qalb, a fitra, an aql, and the aql, the intellect, is a function of the heart, and we have a nafs, and all of these things are a dynamic interplay. So when we're talking about certainty, we know that the human being doesn't start with doubt. The human being actually, already has a form of knowledge within them, within their fitrah, within the innate disposition, namely that Allah is a reality, is worthy of worship, but it gets clouded. And there are different ways to uncloud the fitrah, to awaken the truth within. So we must become more intellectually and spiritually mature in order to achieve that. And then we talked about the other category of doubts, which takes us away from the threshold or the levels of yaqeen that we spoke about, ilm al-yaqeen, haqq al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, and haqq al-yaqeen. It takes us away from that threshold. And these can include intellectual doubts, ethical doubts, social doubts, doubts caused by lack of spirituality, and doubts caused by parents. And some of these things can address the first type of doubt too. So intellectual doubts, namely science, that's not a problem as we discussed, because we talked about the problem of induction. We talked about just because something is true doesn't mean, just because something works, it doesn't mean it's absolutely true. And we talked about the epistemic value of divine knowledge and human knowledge, scientific knowledge. We spoke about ethical doubts, and we spoke about the fact that, Allah's commands explains objective morals. It explains their nature, why they're mind independent and where they came from. Allah's commands does that. Allah's commands also provide us a sense of why the Islamic ethical tradition is true. These are true morals that we must follow because they've come from Ar-Rahman. They come from the merciful, the loving, the knowing, the wise. They've come from Al-Bar, the source of all goodness. So his commands not only provide an understanding of why morals are objective, but they provide why these morals are also true because of who he is. He is the source of all goodness. Then we talked about social doubts, informational social influence, normative social influence, and how we could create strategies within our communities in order to basically deal with these sources of doubts. Because if someone has a need to belong, they will suspend their beliefs and maybe adopt false beliefs just to belong. And if someone has a need for certainty, but they can't get that certainty from their subgroup, they go to the dominant group, and by virtue of them being dominant, they will accept their ideas. So we have to develop strategies to actually prevent that from happening. We also talked about doubts caused by lack of spiritual connection. We have to understand the heart and how it plays a fundamental role even in our level of iman and our level of certainty, and whether we're outside of the threshold of yaqeen or within the threshold of yaqeen. And that's all to do with what's going on within our hearts. Kibr. If we have too much kibr, then we'll leave the religion totally, right? If it's the kind of kibr like shaitan's kibr, may Allah protect all of us. So we briefly spoke about the 4 spiritual diseases where all the other spiritual diseases spring forth. Kibr, arrogance. We spoke about riya, ostentation, showing off. We spoke about ujub, self-amazement. We spoke about hasad. And you need to develop strategies and ways on how to deal with that. We also talked about that you have to do your morning and evening adhkar in your du'as, your remembrance and your du'as. And obviously I forgot to mention, you have to pray 5 times a day. You have to engage in the inner dimensions of worship. You have to do tadabbur of the Quran. Allah says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنِ. Do they not reflect upon the Quran, or there are locks on their hearts? So the more tadabbur, the more pondering you do, the more your heart becomes unlocked to receive Allah's guidance and mercy. So if we engage in some of these things, recitation of the Quran, it's a shifa of the believers, tadabbur of the Quran, it unlocks our hearts, more pondering of the Quran, the dhikr in the morning and the evening, which is absolutely essential. Praying 5 times a day, being on this spiritual path in accordance to the Quran and Sunnah, that's going to help us, because if the heart is hard, the aql is not functioning that well, because the aql, right, is a function of the heart, right? This is my tadabbur here. So we need to have a well-oiled machine, right? And also we spoke about doubts caused by lack of parents. We didn't go much into it. I'm not qualified in this, but just to get us thinking, are some of these things based on psychodynamic and parental experiences? How can I unravel that in order for me to come closer to my deen and therefore remove these doubts? Because some doubts may seem to be intellectual. And from my experience, when I spoke to many people, it was actually as a result of having bad relationships with their parents in the past, and all of these things are something that needs to be explored. So, brothers and sisters, once again, I've gone way too long and I have to drive an hour now and I'm going to be late for an event. So, alhamdulillah, at least I finished it this time. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless every single one of you. There's so much more that we can speak about. There's so much more that we can talk about these things. Some of these things I had to give you a crude understanding. Some of these things I had to just skim over because each section could go on and on and on, especially in the philosophy of science, especially in ethics, especially in all of these things. But hopefully maybe one day what we'll do, we'll just focus on one section and talk about it thoroughly, and that would provide more food for thought. But yeah, so hopefully this has planted seeds in your heart and mind in order for you to explore further. If there are any issues, doubts, or concerns, any questions, obviously I can't take them right now because I have to go. I have an event. What I do suggest you do is that you basically type your questions and send them to Messengers of Peace, and hopefully they could come back with me with like the top 10 questions and categorize them, and I will provide answers for them, inshallah. So looking forward to speaking to you all very soon. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless every single one of you. Anything good is from Allah. Anything
alert from system UI server, low battery.
Low battery, thank you. Anything that is good, that is bad or wrong or incoherent and not explained very well has come from my nafs and shaitan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.